Welcome to the Finance Garage podcast, your go-to podcast for navigating the world of finance. I'm Jonathan, your financial guide, bringing the latest market trends, investment strategies, and financial news that matters to you. And by the way, I'm also going to share my other passion, which is cars.
At the SWU Group, we help everyday families achieve financial success. Our integrated services include financial planning, accounting, credit advisory, and estate planning. We're here to guide and support you every step of the way, from custom investment strategies to maximizing tax efficiency. We ensure your financial goals are met with peace of mind. Visit simonwu.com.au for more information.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Finance Garage. Jonathan Wu here, as always, Principal and Senior Financial Advisor here at the SW Group. And today we're going to take a bit of a different tact, and we're going to dive into a topic that's actually got nothing to do with investments, at least not directly. It's around personal cybersecurity. Now, we've heard stories of people losing their hard-earned money or having their personal information exposed online. It's a risk that really affects every one of us. And whether you're a business owner or just someone trying to manage their own digital life at home or their own money. The story I wanted to kick off with is a friend of a friend recently divulged that they had lost $600,000 in a synthetic gold index exposure investment. Now, the fact of the matter is that they sort of mentioned this during a coffee, like as if you said, oh, my kid won gold at the school carnival sort of thing. And it was quite shocking because $600,000 to, I think, let's call it 99% of people is quite material. But, you know, this actually happens every day, and they lost it through a WeChat chat group, believe it or not. So today, setting that context, to help us navigate this crucial subject, I'm thrilled to welcome Tony Visor to the show. Tony is a seasoned digital risk and governance executive with over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity and privacy. He's not only an expert in this space, but also a regular speaker on businesses and individuals alike on how they could protect themselves from cyber threats. Now, me and Tony go way back. We're now in 2024. We met 10 years ago.
We met 10 years ago, that's right.
And we did our Sydney University's Global Executive MBA, which I'll give a small plug to because as alumni, we do like to say these things. It is still the number one ranked executive MBA in the country.
It is.
Because they rank them every 5 years or so. So that's where I met Tony. And Tony was has always been in the IT industry. And I literally couldn't think of a better person because Tony's spoken at my CPA discussion group a number of times in different capacities. So welcome, Tony.
Jono, thank you, and appreciate being on the show.
Now, it's sort of like cutting to the chase, but why are people so ignorant about personal cybersecurity?
Look, I think there's two reasons. I think the first is that unless you've experienced it, you don't expect it to happen to you. That's the first one, and it's something that's very hard to see. It's not like a hold-up. You know, the old-fashioned bank robberies where someone would show up with a sawn-off shotgun. That's very tangible and real and quite scary. But a cyber incident or someone sort of breaking into your bank account and taking your money is very, very different in digital setting because you don't see it. All right. The second one is what I call the she'll be right mentality that we have, particularly here in Australia, because we often don't think that it's an issue, and we often will. For example, we won't update our phones. And I know a lot of people who hate updating their phones because guess what? I've got to take 10 minutes out of my day to let it reboot and it's a pain in the backside to do. So that's really the two reasons, in my view.
Talking about something like software updates, like I'll even use my mum as a good example. Like, you know, recently there was the latest update from iOS 17 to 18, you know, for newer devices that can access Apple Intelligence and whatnot. I think a lot of people with the update issue is not only that 10 minutes out of my day, reboot the device, but stuff changes.
Yeah.
And it's like, I swear to God, the camera was there.
Yeah.
Or activating Bluetooth was here. It's no longer here. It's like, I got to relearn everything. So I understand for people that are a lot older, it is a struggle. Like most recently, a live example, since I think the 1st of November, And I'm very supportive of it, but I'm also very empathetic with clients at our practice. Is that, and we've got 500 clients here. Is that Macquarie Bank, which is one that we partner up with to provide a lot of the services for our clients. About 3 years ago, they basically switched off SMS authentication and created their own authenticator app. So they were way before Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator, which is actually awesome. So it means that becomes incredibly hard to hack Authenticator, right? Nothing's impossible, but it makes it a lot harder than even SMS. And since November the 1st, basically clients can't get money out of their pension accounts, as in more than their normal ones, like lump sum withdrawals, unless they got Authenticator, because we're basically on the phone with them and saying, okay, so you want to pull out $50,000, they're going to send a push notification and you authenticate that way and give me back the code. And I can tell you 70% of our clients they just went, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've had streams of clients as they're coming up for their reviews, usually we see them, once or twice a year. And, we're going through that process, setting them up on the banking platform, setting them up on Authenticator, teaching them how to do it, right? Test a transaction for them. And what's, in your opinion, what's an easier way to help clients understand how important it is? Because they think it's just a pain.
Yeah. And look, sadly, a lot of people think it's a pain. Yesterday, there was a study released by the Australian Computer Society that said that 60% of employees will actively circumvent cybersecurity controls their company puts in because it is too hard for them to have to deal with it, and they want to look for an easier way to do things, right? So as humans, we always typically look for the path of least resistance.
Easy way out.
The easy way out. Now, this is where security is actually quite an interesting concept. And again, having done this for a long time, you think of your house, right? Think of the fact that, you've got a front door, you've got a back door, you've got locks, you might have a security grill, right? The more locks you put on your door, the more secure you're going to be, but the longer it's going to take to open up, correct? All right. So there's a compromise and a balance that you need to sort of look at from a security perspective and say, okay, well, what's realistic in this sort of scenario? What are we protecting? Because if you're protecting something in limited value, you may not need as much security as you would need if you're protecting high value information. One of the reasons why the banks have gone down the authenticator path and the two-factor piece is because it's money. Like that's as valuable as it gets in terms of protecting. My suggestion would be, if you are thinking it's difficult, it really is to protect. I've had to deal with breach after breach after breach where people have lost millions of dollars. I've had to deal in cases where I've seen a mother hold a baby, go to court and ask for a judge to effectively reset their identity because every part of her identity, including her SIM card, was stolen, duplicated, and when she was putting in the two-factor, getting a SIM, message that said, enter this number, the hackers were getting that message at the same time, and she was completely cleaned out. And this was a young mum who had to go to court with all these documents and had to get every aspect of her life reset effectively. It is going to get worse because everything is digital and everything is going even more digital. It's going to get worse because now you've got things like AI that make those phishing emails, the ones that used to be badly written, like a lot more convincing. We're seeing instances now where people's voices and people's video, the images are being duplicated, where you're getting a phone call or you're getting a video from your boss saying, listen, I need you to transfer that money now, and you won't know any better. And if your boss, as a video message comes up and tells you to do something, you're going to do it, right?
Do it.
Yeah. So it's getting more and more difficult, and that's why I would encourage the people listening to this podcast that as painful and as difficult as it is, it's very much in your interest to actually work with this, do these things to protect themselves, because you don't want to be dealing with the mess that could happen.
I mean, the thing I also remind clients as well is with any of these scammers, hackers, whatever, right? They only just need to get one right. So, when people go, and I'm sure one day I'm going to tell, Jaden, my son, this, and go, I want you to get 100% on a test, right? Hackers don't need that.
Yep.
Right? They'll attack 100 people. If they get one, like they've hit the jackpot.
Yep,
right?
correct.
Now, some of the most recent examples that I've used with clients to, I guess, help them understand how easy it is, we've had situations in the last couple of years. Optus got hacked. Medibank Private got hacked. Latitude Finance got hacked. These are conglomerates. Like, this is not, two guys in a room like us. Yeah. And you kind of go, hang on, these guys got hacked? Now, the way that they were hacked is almost in 3 different directions as well. But I think even, correct me if I'm wrong, Tony, a number of years ago, wasn't even Medicare hacked? And like people's medical information got leaked?
Yeah. There's been instances where information has been lost from government systems, absolutely, in the past. Yeah. And sometimes information lost is physical. There's been instances where they've sold filing cabinets that are ex-government and there's still documents in the filing cabinets and they forgot to check. That actually has happened. But you'll also find, if you ever read any of the audit office reports for federal or state government, and people think government is secure, there are a lot of government departments that fail their own standards when it comes to information security. Because, wow. And that's in the audit office reports. You can read the one that recently came out for New South Wales state government and federal, absolutely, right? The reality is, to your point, you just need to make a mistake, all right? You need to leave the door unlocked just once. And in the physical world, if you leave the door unlocked just once, you need a physical person to actually go there, realise, and then go in and break in. When you're on the internet, you've got the whole world there, right? So the chances of someone breaking in and doing things is far more, it's far more common to occur, and it does occur, right? So this is the other thing. It's just because you don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. One of the best visualizations I've ever given, a client who's like, oh, I don't know why, someone would target me, is to say, look, no one's going to target you. They're not targeting you because they have a problem with you or it's a personal against you. They're looking for a system that is vulnerable, and they will then look at getting in and then monetizing it. That's all they care about, all right? And I've shown them examples where I've gone into some of the tools that I use, and you can see people using the internet trying to get into a firewall, and you just see a list of them constant. A lot of this stuff is automated, right? And the moment they can get in at a very early level, that's when the human comes in and starts, taking over and causing issues. They're doing it because it's easy money. It's ransomware because guess what? If you can get in and I can ransom and say you pay me or I will lock everything and delete everything, a lot of people are going to pay.
Interesting you raise this point about ransomware. I had I think a client or an associate that was infiltrated by a Russian hacker, and then they locked up the files and then put the ransomware out. And they would call him and say, okay, so you've got like 1,000 files, it's $5 a file, so it's $5,000. And the hackers are really, really smart because they will already have scoped you out as a target and know that balance between something ludicrous that you wouldn't be willing to pay versus something that is enough for them to make some money, but it's important for them to unlock. It's like asking, Optus to pay a $10 million ransom versus asking Jonathan Wu to pay a $10 million ransom. It's just impossible, right? Yeah. I just let it go. And within that context, the hackers, in that particular example, he paid the money, got the files unlocked. You may or may not believe this. Actually, you've probably seen something like this. The Russians actually called them afterwards and said, your files are unlocked. Can you please check? They're unlocked? Great. I just want to confirm, were you happy with our service?
Yeah.
Like absolutely. As if it was a genuine service offering they provided you. Yeah. Because they also want to be known in the market that if you pay, they will unlock.
Correct. There are parts of the world where these hackers are actually employees of legitimate organisations, and this is a service model for them. All right. There are parts of the world where this is perfectly fine and it's condoned. And sadly, you're absolutely right. I've worked in the past on matters where they are highly professional organisations that you negotiate with, right, to actually settle a ransom, And to your point, they're acting as if they are doing you a favour by saying, we've discovered this vulnerability, we're not going to go public with it, you just pay us the money, we'll keep our mouth shut and we'll show you how we did it so that it never happens to you again. All right? And to your point further around the honourable aspect, they don't want a reputation, to your point, where you pay and you don't get these files unlocked. So these are legitimate organisations very often that operate a business model like your business or my business legitimately. And the parts of the world where they operate in will say within their jurisdiction, as long as you're not targeting our people, we don't care what you do. And hence why very often it's Eastern European and parts of the world where we may not have friendly relationships with that are targeting us. That's how it happens.
Very much so. Now, recently, in our MBA group, we talk about to the point where I forgot the name of your LinkedIn. It's something about fish and chips.
Tony's Fish and Chips.
There you go.
Yes.
Tony's Fish and Chips.
Subscribe if you're interested in cybersecurity.
There you go. Now, you recently wrote an article on Tony's Fish and Chips called "Why Rodent Control and Cybersecurity Really Aren't All That Dissimilar." So, can you contextualize that? Why did you write it?
Yeah.
Let's dig into that, because I think that's where we're going to get a lot of benefit for our listeners around how they need to visualize personal security.
Yeah. Look, the article that I wrote was an experience that I had living in a house that we were in a few years ago, and we'd bought a house that was a bit of a train wreck in terms of needing to be redone. We redid it, but what had happened was my front door, there was a big gap between the bottom of the door and where the floor was because we hadn't finished the tiling, right? Now, why I say this is because about 2 or 3 months in, when we've moved in, my partner is watching TV. I've gone off somewhere and she quickly screams at me. She goes, "I just saw a mouse walk past," right? And I'm like, "Are you hallucinating?" I don't think so, right? So I didn't believe it, right? Lo and behold, I then see this mouse walk past. So at that point, I do believe it, right? So it so happened that we had a mouse problem in the house. Now, I've never had a mouse problem in my life, I do admit, so this is all quite new. But we discovered that the vulnerability had been this gap in the door that we hadn't finished. And guess what? Mice comes in, you catch one, you realise that you haven't caught all of them because there's always more than one, right? And this whole sort of experience for me was really, it demonstrated how cyber security can often be sort of portrayed, particularly around criminals and cyber criminals. You said earlier that very often these hackers and cyber criminals will come in and scope things out, right? And that's exactly what they do. A lot of the time they'll penetrate a network, they won't immediately attack, they'll actually want to understand what's going on, see what's valuable. Almost like rodents. The rodents will come in, they'll have a look around, they'll snoop around, they'll see where the food source is. It was only months later that I found they had also found another gap in one of our cupboards, in our pantry, and they'd gone and eaten all this stuff in our pantry that I wasn't even aware of because there was a gap in the back of the cupboard that I hadn't seen.
Were you aware of the food though?
Yeah, well, see, here's the thing, you sometimes at the back of the pantry you've got this food that you don't use very often, right?
Yep.
Didn't realise until we had to use it. I'm like, oh wow, there's a hole in this bag of, oats, right? So you don't know the damage has happened. The only other identifier was there was, mouse poo that we were finding. We're like, why the hell is this all here, right? Because guess what? They had infiltrated, the cupboards and everything else because they'd come in. So what that then ended up kicking off was an entire renovation process of my kitchen that I had to seal all these things, all these gaps. And in the end, we got on top of it and we dealt with it, right? But with cyber criminals, you don't know when they're in. You only know once you've started seeing the symptoms. You don't know what damage they've done. And this is why I wrote this article, right? And often you don't know the damage until a long time after, right? And it's really useful to think of cyber criminals the same way because we didn't know we had a problem until we saw it. And until we saw it, we didn't realise we had a problem, right? So the same way you would deal with pests and rodents is how, from a personal and a business perspective, thinking of cybersecurity is going to be really beneficial.
One thing you talk about in the article is around personal firewalls and cleaning up. You mentioned the importance of firewalls and the sanitation practices in both cybersecurity and drawing those parallels to rodent control. I mean, for the average person, what would you consider to be the essential firewalls in their digital life, and what kind of digital cleanup habits should they adopt to maintain that cybersecurity hygiene?
Yeah, so in traditional computing sense, a firewall is a device that allows traffic in that you want it to allow and does not permit traffic in that you don't want, and vice versa, because sometimes what you want to do is you want to make sure that stuff that shouldn't be leaving the network doesn't leave. All right. From a people perspective, we are the best firewalls because we're the ones that can make the decision to say, okay, well, should I post my boarding pass and passport on Instagram to tell all my friends that I've gone overseas for a holiday, right? Probably not a good idea. So that in itself is a decision that we make as human beings, right? So it comes down to having the technology that prevents things from happening. That's really important. But then also having the people controls to make sure that we exercise the right discretion. Do you want to be sending an email with credit card numbers attached, as an Excel spreadsheet, right? Probably not, right? So we do need to use discretion when we use things. And often it's counterintuitive. We talked at the very start that, people are inherently lazy. We look for the path of least resistance, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes we have to use our better judgment and go, you know what? Yeah, I could do that, but that's risky. And maybe I shouldn't do that because it's too risky. Let me do it this way. So we are the best firewalls. The technology is great, but firewalls can be circumvented. I've seen it happen all the time. All right. So you've really got to be better at people controls, technology controls, and also process, particularly for businesses. There are policies and procedures in place for reasons. Very often organisations put these policy procedures and employees might go, oh, why do we need to follow this? Well, it's there for a really good reason. And if we don't follow policy, that's when you start having issues, and you want to avoid that.
You mentioned something that I think is also quite critical, and this, I think, is relevant both from a personal context as well as a business. But if you're looking from a personal one first, for the benefit of my clients, you mentioned that just buy or set up what you need, right? Yep. Because you can set up all these different things, but then you think that that's, extra layers of security, but it actually genuinely creates potential points of vulnerability. Can you sort of walk through that theory?
Yeah. Look, one of the most common things that I do when I talk with my clients is I ask them, I go, when's the last time you went through your phone and deleted any apps you don't use? And very often it's like, well, what do you mean? Like, what's that got to do with cybersecurity? Never
is my answer, by the way.
There we go. So my answer is, well, every application on your phone is an application in itself that has its own risks and vulnerabilities. So if you're able to reduce the number of potential risks on your phone, i.e. remove apps that you don't need, then that reduces your potential vulnerability exposure, right? So I will regularly go through my phone. If I'm not using an app, if I haven't used it in 2 or 3 months, deleted, right? And I can reinstall it. If I ever need to come back to it, I'll reinstall it. But the less stuff you have on your devices in terms of applications and software and services, the less vulnerable you're going to be inherently. So a really simple technique that costs $0 is go through your phone, uninstall apps that you don't know. And you'll realise a lot of people go to conferences and there's conference event apps and there's this and that. These things don't get patched very often. So if they get exploited by a cyber criminal, it's through this app that you haven't used in 2 years that they're going to do it. They're going to record, they're going to see your contacts, they're going to see your emails, they're going to see personal information, So get rid of it. Get rid of it. It's the same on your computer. It's the same if you're running a business and you're running a whole bunch of services. Often you're paying for. All right, so first of all, there's a cost. So if you get rid of services you don't need, you're saving money. That's the first thing. But secondly, you're closing a potential set of vulnerabilities. So streamline your IT, right, is the best way to do it. It's less complex, it's going to help you run faster, it's going to be more cost effective, and it's going to significantly reduce your risk.
Would a practical example be, and I'm just thinking about this on the fly, is that if you commit to a technology platform or ecosystem, let's call it, the Apple. So use an Apple iPhone, use Apple Watch, use a MacBook, Apple TVs as your streaming device, so on and so forth. Does that generally make things safer?
Well, you know, like there's pros and cons of all of that, because if you run, say, the Apple ecosystem, and I'm someone who likes my Apple stuff, so I use that most frequently, yeah, there are advantages because you get to unify things. But from a security perspective, if all these devices haven't been updated and if they're configured incorrectly and they've got a whole bunch of crap on there that you don't need installed, they're going to be as vulnerable as a Windows system that is exactly the same way. So the idea is, and actually it's interesting because I know we talked about cars in our little introduction talk. Would you ever buy a car and not get it serviced? If I bought a brand new car today, and if I didn't get serviced maybe for a year, I'd get away with it. 2 years, it's probably going to start to, you know, by the 3-year mark, like the thing's going to fall apart. It's the same with technology. If you need to service technology and maintain the technology, otherwise it's going to fall apart, whether it's Apple or Windows or whatever, right? And in doing that and maintaining that hygiene, that's when you're updating, you're checking whether services are needed, you're disabling stuff you don't need. We find more often than not that criminals will use services that have been installed that the company's forgotten about. Or if you've got staff and you have a staff member who has left and they had access into your system, someone's forgotten to disable that.
Ah, yes.
And guess what? They'll use that person's login details to get in, right? So doing things like user access reviews. The other thing is, a lot of the times you might, this is actually probably a really relevant and useful one for your audience members. If you are using an administrator account on your computer to do your day-to-day work, you need to stop that right now, and you need to turn that administrator account into a user account and have a separate administrator account that is only used to administer the system. Because if you're using your computer on a day-to-day user as an administrator, that has really high privileges, and it means you can install software, you can delete software, you can do a whole bunch of different things. That is really bad practice. So you need to restrict that. And people do it because it's easy. We talked at the very start. People do it because, you know what, I don't have to install a password every time I want to install software, but it's there for a reason.
I never thought about that, because the default setting when you set up your laptop or whatnot is the first person that goes in is the administrator.
Yep.
And you go, because I remember, I think that the terms have changed now, but I remember when I set up networks, years ago, you have administrator, but then you've got this term called power user.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah.
They still do.
They still do. Okay. Okay. I no longer set up, I don't have the hours in the day, but yeah, that was the difference, right? Power users didn't have quite the power of an administrator, and that was sort of your stopgap from dealing with problems.
Ready to take the first step in investing, or just looking to continue growing your wealth without being inundated with financial information? With SWU Online Invest, we offer a range of expertly managed portfolios designed to match your investment needs. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just getting started, know that we will work tirelessly to ensure your investments are strategically positioned to maximize your goals. Visit swuonlineinvest.com.au today.
Now, you sort of briefly talked about it when we brought up this article, and it's the issue around misjudging threats, right? And you sometimes you don't know how big of a problem it is until it hits you, or the symptoms come out about it, right?
Yeah.
Are there common misconceptions within individuals about the size and severity of their actual risk? Like, they misconceive it. They go, it's not that big a deal. Or the she'll be right thing that you mentioned.
Yeah. So a common one is where a breach has happened, and you get the inevitable email from the company that's been breached that says, your information was part of this breach, blah, blah, blah. What is at risk in those sorts of instances? It may be inconsequential information. All right. For example, you might think, it's just an email address, it's a name, my address, whatever. All right. However, if you think of all the data points that are available on the internet, if you are wanting to commit identity fraud, you could use that sort of information, couple it with other information, and then all of a sudden you can create a profile of an individual. And this happens because what we find very often people, and you would know this in the financial side, someone's gone and opened up a bank account or a credit card in a person's name. The person has no idea And the only time they find out about it is when they get the credit reporting agency contacting them saying, hey, you owe us, or the debt recovery agency saying, hey, we're waiting for this payment to be made and you haven't paid. And they turn around and go, what payment? Well, your credit card has been, over its limit for 3 months and we've tried contacting you and you haven't paid and we're now here to collect. And by the way, your credit rating is shot now because we've marked all of that. And you're like, what credit card are you talking about? This credit card. And this poor person has no idea what they're talking about because someone's gone and opened up a card, done it fraudulently, gone and spent it and taken all the money out. All of a sudden, someone's life has turned a little bit upside down because of that, right? So that's how they use information. The Medibank breach, the criminals were quite insidious because if you followed what happened there, what they did was they went through the information that they had exfiltrated out of the network and they said, oh, here are some really interesting individuals with some really interesting medical results that they probably don't want to publicise, right? We'll release this if you don't pay. And they use that as leverage, right? So the information is going to be valuable to somebody. And in fact, interestingly, medical information is typically the most valuable because as a medical record, it's often the most complete. It's got name, address, date of birth, it's got everything, it's got your blood test result, everything, right? So from a dark web, when we talk about dark web and the value of information on dark web, medical records, complete medical records are the most valuable.
I think you showed a presentation that you did for one of my groups before. There was like this table that showed the financial value. It was amazing. Like there's a market price for certain types of information. Like a debit card's almost worth nothing, right?
Correct.
Credit card's worth a little bit more, and then personal name, date of birth, driver's license are worth a bit more, and then and at the bottom is like medical records because it's like the most, or at the top, depending on And I mean, here's an interesting question. I mean, do these market prices fluctuate over time too?
Yeah, they do. Absolutely.
It's there's a market for everything. Yeah. Literally, completely. Right? You can sell that. Now, here's this issue about continuous vigilance. Right. And I'll share a story here because one of my staff members actually suffered this. They had their mailbox broken into.
Yep.
They live in an apartment block. Basically, the entire apartment block's mailboxes all got broken into. And everything was stolen, and then that was it. Like, there was no instant reaction to go, bugger, my mail got stolen. All right, I hope it wasn't anything important. That's the initial thought process.
Yeah.
6 months later, my team member's husband lost access to the Telstra network on the mobile phone, but he didn't realise it. This is going back about 5 years ago, right? All of a sudden it said no service, SOS only, whatever. And he thought, okay, maybe the network's gone out, Telstra's gone down, whatever, right? And then realised it wasn't. And then in the meantime, what had happened, someone had gone into a Telstra shop, recreated their identity, said, this is me, give me a new SIM card, and then the chain of events started happening. They then went through, I think ANZ Bank was the bank at that time, and they flushed them out. Like, they could literally see their money just disappear in front of their eyes. I mean, what do you say about the ongoing vigilance part? Because that's a whole lot about judgment. You can't get ChatGPT to work that through with you. I mean, what's the best ways you think you could express to people what do they need to look out for with regards to being vigilant? Yeah.
Look, I often, whenever I catch public transport and I see someone walking around, there might be a doctor or a nurse at a hospital and they're walking around with their name badge still on their uniform with their full name and a photo there. I often cringe and I'm like, what are you doing, right? It's understanding the element of privacy and trying to keep that keeping that information as private as possible, not divulging things. We live in a really interesting world these days because these days we're encouraged almost by social media companies to go, put your life on social media, tell everyone about everything. Whereas as a kid, and I've told this example many, many times, my uncle who used to live with us, I remember him voting at an election, and he came home and I asked him, I said, who did you vote for? And he was not happy that I asked him this question. And it kind of struck me because I'm like, well, it's pretty obvious, but he came from a country where like politics was often life and death, and voting was a very private matter. You didn't tell anybody because there could be repercussions. We didn't have that problem here in Australia, of course, right? But contrast that and the secret ballot. There's a reason why it's a secret ballot to these days where it's pretty obvious you're going to know very quickly, particularly in the US context where you're a Trump supporter or a Kamala Harris supporter, right? And we saw that play out, and we see it in politics here in this country, right? So we're encouraged to share. Vigilance means you share only what you need to, right? Because any of that information can often be used. I often talk about, from an information security perspective, the importance of getting things like a PO box, right? People think, mail, whatever. Well, to your point about the person who had their letterbox broken into, get a PO box, it's 120 odd bucks a year, and have your mail go there and go collect it, right? First of all, they're never going to know where you live because it's under a PO box, right? And secondly, at least it's more secure. From a vigilance perspective, when it comes to things like passwords, like changing passwords, making sure you've got, don't use the same password for everything. Again, we're human beings, and very often what happens is you break into one account, they end up using the password because the email address is often the same. They log in using that password, right? Or at a very minimum, have different categories of passwords where for really sensitive applications you have unique passwords and maybe a password keeper that stores everything. And then you might have like really basic stuff that's like, you've set up an account on a website to, access an article and they just want your name and email address. Like, yeah, maybe reuse your not saying that you should, but people are obviously lazy. Sometimes they might go, okay, you know what, for that, but there's no payment, there's no personal information, there's no nothing, yeah, whatever, right? Because it can be hard to manage passwords. But for your sensitive stuff, you need unique passwords. You need things like two-factor.
Talking about those password managers, I think there was a company, LastPass, got hacked.
Yeah.
So how in my personal viewpoint, how safe is that then? Because it's like you then put your reliance on something else, then that gets hacked.
Yeah. So it's like the old days where people used to write on a notepad all of their passwords, right? So LastPass did get hacked, and they turned around and said, look, yeah, we got hacked. However, no one's passwords were accessed as part of that. So at least from that perspective, it was fine. And how they do their technology, they made sure that didn't occur. But there's a risk. There's always a risk, right? But the reality is it's very difficult to remember all these passwords. And imagine writing them all down, right? It would be pretty difficult, but there's people that still do that. And for people that works, absolutely, write them down, put them in your safe at home, and you've got the password. For some, getting a reputable password keeper is really useful as well. And I'd encourage people to look at either that, writing down your password, but the key message is make sure that this stuff is set up properly, you're using strong passwords, you're changing them when you need to change them. There's actually guidance that says, it used to be very recently, you should change your passwords every 3 or 6 months. That guidance actually been pulled by the US government. They actually have removed that to say 3 or 6 months. They say, you change them as you need them depending on the context. You might want to change them more frequently, you might not need to change them all that frequently, right? And then two-factor authentication, try not to use SMS, and we talked about some of the SMS issues. Try using an authenticator app. You can get these really sophisticated YubiKeys and things where you can use that as an authenticator. But the authenticator is useful because once you've got a password, once you've got the authenticator, that is that extra layer of security. It's not that difficult to do. So I would encourage everyone, if you haven't done it already, absolutely do that.
I guess the final thing to talk about is the response part, right? Incident response, both at a personal or a business context, right? And this is what you specialize in as well. So Tony, you've recently started your own consulting practice called Novera Consulting.
That's right.
So, for people on listening to the podcast, if you're looking for help, I can tell you, Tony's the guy. I'm not being paid to say that. Tony is a friend. That's our biggest conflict of interest. We are mates for over a decade. But if we look at incident response, I think the most critical thing from what I have seen is time and speed of response.
Yep.
That's my very simplistic view of the world. Can you sort of expand on that and how people should react?
Yeah. Time, speed, and preparation. All right, because for a cyber incident, And for people on the podcast, you will have an incident at some point in time. I will guarantee you. It will absolutely happen. However, you can have varying degree of impact from that incident, right? And I'll give you an example. I'm sure we've all put a piece of toast in the toaster. Now that piece of toast has the potential of burning your house down, right? If you leave it in there too long and it catches fire and there's no one there to go and put it out and take it out and chuck it in the sink and douse it in water, it can burn your house down, right? In the best case scenario, someone's realised it's been there too long, they press the eject button, they pull it out and it's gotten a little bit burnt, right? So you've got that whole scenario anywhere between slightly burning toast to burning the whole house down in terms of incident. It's exactly the same in the world of cybersecurity, because if you have incident response and preparation in place where you are expecting at some point in time it's going to happen, and when it does, these are the things we need to implement, right? Your impact is going to be far more reduced than if you've got no preparation and all of a sudden you're dealing with a phone call from a Russian hacker who says, I've got all your information. First of all, you won't know whether you can verify it or not. If you're relying on your systems, you may not be able to do that at that point in time. One of the questions I often ask companies is, when you've got incident response plans, assuming you do have one, do you have it printed on paper, or is it on the same server that could be crypto locked that you won't be able to access, right? And very often the answer is, oh no, it's just digital. I go, well, you probably want to print it in an old-fashioned folder and update it as you do, right? Get a lawyer. If you do have a cyber breach and you realise that you're really in trouble, get a cyber lawyer to help you out, because what's going to happen is that they're going to have to notify regulators. There's actually obligations from a regulatory perspective, depending on where you play. You've definitely got to notify under the Privacy Act through notifiable data breaches if you're turning over a certain size or whatever it might be. We just had a passage of the Cybersecurity Act, which means that if you pay a ransom, you have to notify that you have paid.
Who are you notifying?
You notify the federal government, and they'll do their investigations to figure out where the money's gone, whether they can get it back, etc., etc.
Is that the Office of the Privacy Commissioner? Was that one?
No, you go through the Australian Cybersecurity Centre.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when it comes to cybersecurity, I know we're not going to do a legal podcast, but when it comes to cybersecurity, Privacy Act is around the breach itself, because you need to notify the Privacy Commissioner. You might need to notify a regulator. If you're ASIC or APRA, you might need to do that. And now you need to notify the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, who works with the Australian Signals Directorate. That's part of the Department of Defence, and they'll get involved. Increasingly, we're starting to see from a board and director perspective, the regulators chasing directors in case they've had a significant cyber breach and they feel that the company didn't do what was fair and reasonable.
So that's the director's duties part.
Director's duties, that's right. So there's a lot of oversight here, and there's a lot of scrutiny happening. And Joe Longo, who's the head of ASIC, very recently said that ASIC is now going after directors actively. So that is very much the case. So how you avoid all of this is to be ready, to be prepared. Like the old Boy Scouts used to say, be prepared. What does that mean? Look at defence. Look at being ready to respond if something does happen. Having an incident response plan. If you don't have cyber insurance, you might want to consider cyber insurance, because very often what happens is if you've got a cyber insurance policy, you might get access to some services and a lawyer who can help you. Then incorporate the lessons that you've learned from that incident and build it into improving the business going forward, because there is, as sad as this might sound, you'll have an incident, you'll learn from things, and hopefully you can prevent it from happening again.
So you bring up a good point, Tony, around cyber insurance.
Yeah.
So, we do have a cyber insurance policy in force. Usually when you consider any form of insurance, you're insuring an asset, right? And so, for us, we advise our clients, you're insuring your income or you're insuring your life, right? There is somewhat of a formulaic way to get to a number. When you insure your car, it's the value of the car. You insure the house, it's the value of the house. But with cyber insurance, it's very different, because from a lot of other insurances, because when I look through that list with my broker, there's like so many options. You know, when you get car insurance, like windscreen, rental car. In the world of cyber, it's like, do you need PR? Do you need hot sites? Like that's a general one that you understand, right? Like you can easily work out this is how much a hot site will, you know, or a cold site, whatever, to be set up, right? You can formulate like how much do I need for PR, or how much do I need for, you know, basically. Yeah, there's all these options, which just seems to be such a variable. So I remember it took a while for us as a business to come up with a number.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because that comes down to the business. So when we talk cyber incident response planning, what we care about is how soon do you need to be back up and running before you start losing customers, right? And at what point in terms of your operations do you need to be at so that you're achieving a minimum level of operational ability, all right? So we then work backwards from that. Now, you might be a business that is high profile, in which case you're going to need that PR. Unless you've got your own PR agency that you want to pay, you're going to need some sort of PR and comms. And I think we've seen a lot of examples where companies have not been ready and they've issued really poor communications to market that's then really impacted them. And if you want to have a look, there's a lot of shareholder class actions that are happening because of cyber breaches where, you know, there's shareholders who have said, well, you didn't handle it properly, you've now put my investments at risk, we're going to sue, right? So it comes down to the business context. What sort of cyber do you get? And to your point around numbers, it is very, very difficult to quantify. Cyber insurance should only be considered as the absolute last position. The same way that, you know, if you have a home insurance policy, it doesn't mean that you don't do things like locks and alarms and fire, alarms and all that sort of stuff. You're doing all of that. You're still closing the door every day when you go to work. You're not leaving it wide open. So the cyber insurance should always be that last position, that point of desperation where, you know what, we better use it because now we're going to need it. And I can tell you that a lot of cyber insurance policies will only cover a certain amount. And I've been involved in breaches where I've worked with the insurer where the cost of the breach has been millions, but the insurance policy's only covered a fraction of it, all right? So you've got to look at the risk, you've got to sort of assess where you're at, and then you're going to get the right policy. I often say talk to an insurance broker, and I'm not an insurance broker, but you want to talk to people who can answer that and then help you pick the right insurance policy, because it depends on the organisation, the risk where you need to be at. Because you might be a small business, if you're down for a few days, okay, we'll get a small policy. You might be a mission critical business that can have zero downtime. That's a different kettle of fish altogether.
To finish off this episode, Tony, I'm going to ask an IT guy about investment scams.
Okay.
Right? Because as an investment guy and as a financial advisor, I look at people that get cheated by scams, like the one I referred to right at the beginning in the intro, $600,000 in a synthetic gold index exposure.
Yeah.
There's a million ways you could buy. I mean, not, as we always say on this podcast, no personal advice is being given, but you could buy GOLD on the ASX, and that is your gold exposure because it's linked to the price of gold. You go, why do you go all this effort to... Anyway, Tony, what is the message that you would give people, with regards to, when I see people get caned for crypto scams and stuff like that? It's like, mate, if it's too good to be true, it probably is, but no one listens. Why? Is it just people's greed?
Yeah, well, I think there's an element of greed. I think in things like crypto, there's also a lot of people who don't understand how the technology works. I was very fortunate in a previous role that I did that I assisted with a crypto exchange that was quite high profile in the media that went bust in the US. And the level of knowledge of people who are investing is minimal in terms of security, to the extent that I had to be involved in assisting, putting out comms that said, we will never call you to ask you for money, right? We're trying to get your money back. And if we do call you, this is the process that we will follow. Even if we do call you, we will never ask you for any money, because because people were being impacted. What was happening in that particular matter was there were scammers coming in saying, you're a creditor, right? How about you pay us some money and we'll put you at the front of the queue so that if money does come back, we will reimburse you before we reimburse anyone else, but just pay us X amount of dollars. And people were desperate because people might have had, you know, big exposure in crypto, so they paid that insignificant amount of money, which is still in the thousands, right? And it was all a scam, you see. So there are different ways. Remember, scammers and cyber criminals prey on people's feelings. The moment they feel as though there's a situation where they feel that they can manipulate a person, they'll take advantage of it. One of the most insidious scams that I was ever across was a cyber criminal who encrypted people's personal photos and said, we will decrypt them, but you need to pay us $1 per photo. Now, most people who've got kids or grandkids or whatever will pay that money. They will not even blink, right? And they knew. And you know, he had to end up paying several $1,000s to get his photos of his grandkids back, right? You see, so they prey on people's emotions and feelings. And investment scams are exactly that. We're seeing crypto go through the roof. People are euphoric a little bit, you know, you see it in the media. All of a sudden people are more prone because they're like, I've got to get in on this, I've got to do this otherwise. So they might go to the dodgy link that says, you know, invest in us and we'll promise you X amount in return. The crypto market, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, is actually quite unregulated. So you really have to do your due diligence in terms of who you use, who you're investing with, and making sure that they actually hold that crypto that they're saying. Because very often they'll say, yeah, you own this Bitcoin, but it's not being backed by anything. And we saw this in really big, high-profile cases, right? So that comes down to due diligence. It comes down to doing your due diligence, whether it's from an investment perspective, a cyber perspective.
Yeah, still blows my mind. But on that note, Tony, thanks very much for joining me today and talking about cybersecurity, both at a personal level and at a business level. I think it's broadly not, even with all the amount of breaches that occur, I still don't think people are taking it seriously enough, oddly enough. And I think, you know, your comment, which I think let's use that as the closing comment, is it's not if you're going to get breached, it's when you're going to get breached. And I think that's very important to remember, because if you don't take that approach, I can tell you, you're going to be in a world of pain if you're not psychologically prepared for it. So,
completely. And that's where I'd encourage you, avoid it if you can, and be ready, be prepared, because it will happen, but you can mitigate the impact if you've got plans in place. You absolutely can.
Yeah. So thanks very much for your time, Tony.
Don't I thank you.
This podcast is not financial product advice and is intended to provide information only. It does not take into account the investment objectives, financial situation, or needs of any person. You should assess whether the information is appropriate for you and consider talking to a financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Any investment examples are for illustrative purposes only. The information is taken from sources which are believed to be accurate, but Simon Wu, Jonathan Wu, SWU Financial Planning, and Personal Financial Services Limited accept no liability of any kind to any person who relies on the information contained in the podcast. Unless expressly stated, none of the information should be taken as a recommendation. For more information, please visit www.simonwu.com.au.